She would do anything for her kids.
She was very proud to be a mother.
She was so committed.
And with a new man by her side, there was nothing that could stop her.
Things were on the up and up.
The couple wanted to take it to the next level.
It was just really a beautiful thing to watch.
Until the family vanished.
The whole house was empty.
Why would she move and not tell anybody?
Something wasn't right.
The disappearance triggers a desperate search.
I started making calls.
I was printing flyers at work.
We wanted to hold out hope.
But a horrific discovery will put hope to the test.
I remember my uncle yelling up, "There's something down here."
Whoever did this had to be a sick, deranged individual.
That day was just rough.
And it could get even worse.
You tell me where them kids are.
14. It's a bright summer morning in Detroit, Michigan, a Rust Belt city that's hustling to pull itself up by the bootstraps.
Detroit is a grinding, a hard-working city. You come here, you're going to love and have a passion for the city.
Now, I'm proud to say I'm from Detroit, and I never plan on leaving, honestly.
The morning marks a significant milestone for one Detroit family. Alicia Fox's daughter, Kayla, is graduating kindergarten.
Alicia was extremely excited, so excited that she bought Kayla a custom cap and gown.
It should have been one of the best days ever.
But as the ceremony is about to begin, Kayla's teacher realizes something is wrong.
I'm standing, getting the kindergartners up to go to the stage. And we get to the last student, and I realize Kayla wasn't in line.
Her mother is missing too.
I did a 360 and looked through the audience, and Alicia was not present.
Alicia's husband, Aaron Justice, and their 8-month-old son was absent as well.
The only family member in the crowd is Kayla's father.
Hey, have you seen Alicia or Kayla anywhere?
Kayla's dad was just as puzzled as her teacher.
I've been calling her phone all day, but it's been going straight to voicemail.
So weird. She was so excited about this. She wouldn't miss this.
Unable to reach Alicia, he tries her sister.
Kayla's dad called me saying, "Where's Alicia? Where's Kayla?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "They didn't show up to the graduation." She talked about it all of the time.
At this point, they're starting to be concerned.
There was no way that Alicia was going to miss Kayla's graduation.
Something wasn't right.
"27-year-old Alicia Fox had spent her whole life in the city of Detroit.
We grew up on the east side of Detroit. My mom raised us all. It was 3 girls and 3 boys. And Alicia was like the second mom because, you know, she was the oldest.
Alicia was always the one to protect her loved ones. I just remember her being a sweetheart.
Alicia was versatile. She could tell a joke. She, make people laugh. She would cook and plan family events. She was a backbone to, someone who needed support.
Although by 20 years old, Alicia was busy supporting a family of her own.
After graduating high school, Alicia got very close with a male friend that she grew up with.
They met, I believe it was elementary school. His mom says that she knew that they were gonna grow up and sparks were gonna fly.
They ended up falling in love, and they ended up having a daughter.
I don't think that Kayla was planned, but when they found out about her, they both were equally excited. She was very proud to be a mother. Her entire life became Kayla.
They were best friends. Like, you never really saw Alicia without Kayla.
Alicia and Kayla's father soon went their separate ways, though.
There was like a mutual understanding.
Co-parenting seemed real easy. They got along well, and I just never seen any issues or problems.
Everything they did was in the best interest of Kayla. They communicated with each other. They were able to come together whenever they needed to for Kayla.
Before long, there would be another man in Alicia and Kayla's lives, Aaron Justice.
Alicia and Aaron started dating in 2012.
Oh my gosh, thank you. We're starving.
I gotta take care of my girls.
Much like Kayla's father before him, Alicia had known Aaron for a long time.
They knew each other since Alicia was a teenager. They had a mutual group of friends, so he was always around.
Even though she wasn't trying to be in a relationship, he was smooth, he was suave, and they ended up getting together.
Aaron was very chivalrous. He was pretty much a sweetheart to Alicia.
He also had her back.
He came into Alicia's life and he encouraged Alicia to go back to school to be a medical assistant.
I vividly remember he would make promises to her and she would be like, well, don't flake on me, don't say it if you're not gonna do it. And he'd be like, I promise, Scout's honor.
Aaron kept his promise too, helping take care of Kayla while Alicia went back to school.
You sure you don't mind?
Of course, baby. Let's go. You gotta ace that test.
He and Kayla did have a pretty good relationship, playing around, watching TV, playing games. And Kayla, was cool hanging around him, having him there.
Aaron was so good with Kayla. He was exactly what Alicia had been looking for. So she could see herself spending the rest of her life with him.
And as Alicia was finishing her medical assistant certification, she gave birth to the couple's son, Christian.
She was extremely excited. She wanted more kids, but she wanted a boy.
Aaron was just as excited as Alicia.
And for Alicia, it looked like she'd really hit the jackpot.
After Alicia had Christian, they got married. They moved into a bigger house.
Everything happened very fast, but I was just happy that she was happy. I loved seeing her happy.
Things seemed like they were on the up and up.
But now, on the day of Kayla's kindergarten graduation, the entire family is a no-show.
Alicia had been working hard for weeks to make this moment special. It made no sense.
There was just too much invested in it. She wouldn't have missed it for the world.
Concerned, Alicia's family desperately tries to reach her.
I called her phone, text her, called Aaron's phone, text him. I didn't get through to anybody.
Alicia's sister called other family and friends too, but they hadn't heard from Alicia either.
By the end of the night, I was worried enough to start calling hospitals. I couldn't sleep at all.
The next morning, Alicia's sister and several family members decide to go over to her house.
Alicia!
Alicia, you here?
There was no answer to their knocks, and there was no car in the driveway.
Someone discovered a window was unlocked, so they climbed in and opened the door.
But inside, they find nothing.
All of their stuff was gone.
Everyone thought Alicia Fox had found her fairy tale ending when she fell for 28-year-old Aaron Justice.
I do remember her being really, really happy.
They moved into a bigger house and they got married. So I thought everything was well.
But now, after Alicia missed her daughter's kindergarten graduation, relatives have found her house empty and abandoned.
We all get that feeling where it's like something's not right. That was pretty much the feeling that I had.
It wouldn't have been like Alicia to just pack up her things and the kids' things and just leave without telling her family.
Wherever they were, it doesn't appear that they left in a hurry.
The house was spotless. You would have assumed that it was professionally cleaned.
The whole house smelled like bleach.
And when she searches the basement, Alicia's sister finds a stash of empty bleach containers.
Which raised the red flag, because it's like, why so much bleach?
Was the empty house also a crime scene? Fearing the worst, Alicia's sister goes straight to the police.
I made a missing persons report for everyone. And then Kayla's dad made a separate report on behalf of Kayla.
Alicia's family tells the police officers the last time they saw Alicia was at Memorial Day. She was her normal, bubbly self, and she didn't say anything about moving out of town.
Once Alicia's sister files the report, officers accompany her back to the house.
Of course, they didn't see anything indicative of foul play.
The house was bare. That might lead one to believe the whole family moved, and they just didn't tell anybody.
That's essentially what one neighbor tells the police as they're leaving the empty house.
He walked over and says, "Oh, they just moved."
Well, there was a moving van out here a while ago.
Maybe Aaron and Alicia got into some financial situation, and they can no longer afford the rent here.
If it was due to money troubles, maybe they were too embarrassed to tell anyone.
The family doesn't think so.
That doesn't make any sense.
They're an extremely close-knit family. So for Alicia not to ask for help with the move, or at least share the news, just didn't seem like her.
But at this point, the police are hesitant to launch a full-scale search.
They gave me a report number, pretty much told me, wait to see if you hear from her,
That's it?
That's it. Have a good day.
Many adults leave. They're grown. They can leave on their own. They can come back when they want to.
Unsatisfied, Alicia's family sets out to find their loved ones on their own.
We pretty much started doing our own investigating.
Starting with her sister's social media posts.
On Alicia's social media, a lot of the posts were trying to portray that she was taking the kids to Cedar Point instead of going to Kayla's graduation.
Cedar Point is an amusement park that is 2 hours away.
This is not making any sense.
She had never said anything about skipping the graduation.
Kayla, she's barely tall enough to ride rides. Why would she skip out on this graduation to go to Cedar Point?
There was nothing in Alicia's social media about moving out of their house either.
Something seemed off.
The contents of the posts aren't all that's off either.
The verbiage is different in these posts. She doesn't talk like this. She doesn't use this kind of punctuation.
For Alicia's sister, the implications are clear.
And she does not type like this, no.
Someone else had made the posts.
Why would someone pose as Alicia?
More worried than ever that something horrible has happened, Alicia's sister and her family reach back out to the police.
I'm telling you, she did not post this stuff.
Police ask, is there anyone that would want to do harm to Alicia?
It's a question the family has a hard time answering.
Alicia didn't have enemies.
The only person they could possibly think of was her ex.
Kayla's father?
No, it was a man between him and her husband.
According to Alicia Fox's family, the missing mother of two had a complicated history with her ex-boyfriend, a man named Nick Barnes.
Alicia and Nick's relationship wasn't the best.
They were young, and he made some decisions, that were detrimental to their relationship.
He was a drug dealer, somewhat unsavory character.
In addition to his past relationship with Alicia, Nick also had a history with Alicia's husband, Aaron.
He was not only Alicia's ex, He was Aaron's former best friend.
But that had changed after Nick's drug dealing landed him in jail.
While he was on the inside, Nick asked Aaron to check up on Alicia.
That's when he stepped in and became that supportive friend, trying to help her.
He tried to be a comforting shoulder to Alicia.
Although it wasn't long before Aaron was doing more than just comforting Alicia.
He and Alicia hit it off, and they ended up together.
The family was real happy about their relationship.
I do remember feeling happy that she moved on from being with Nick.
However, when Nick got out of jail, he wasn't as happy about how things had worked out.
He was furious with both Aaron and Alicia. I mean, his friend is now dating his ex-girlfriend.
He regularly let them know how he felt about what he considered their betrayal.
Nick had a history of harassing them. It was so bad that Aaron and Alicia had to move across town. But is this enough to say Nick is the reason the family has disappeared?
Alicia's friends and family aren't so sure.
I would have never thought that he found out where she stayed and then did something to them or anything like that. Because he did love her. You could tell that he loved her, for sure.
But with the whole family missing, detectives aren't so quick to rule it out.
Nick's criminal past raised a lot of red flags.
There was enough information there to make them think possibly he was involved. He's an ex-boyfriend. He's got a criminal past. He had jealousy and resentment for the relationship that Alicia and Aaron had. So Nick had to be looked at as a possible suspect.
But when detectives reach out, Nick isn't interested in talking.
Hello?
This is homicide detective.
I want you to come down to the station to answer some questions about the disappearance of Alicia Fox. Look, if you want to talk to me, call my lawyer.
Nick has dealt with the police before. He's done time, so he knew how the game was played.
Which only leaves detectives more suspicious.
Once you are able to talk to that person and you find out they're not cooperative, you would see what other information you could find out.
While detectives dig deeper into Nick, the family's frustration grows, and they decide to launch their own effort to find Alicia and the others.
We'd hit the ground running.
Alicia's family is in the streets trying to figure out, does anybody have an idea what happened to Alicia and her family?
We had a couple people call and say, oh, I think I saw her. She was walking the baby in a stroller. So we go over there, we're searching, you know, pretty much excited. We did find the girl who actually resembled Alicia, but wasn't her.
Then, on June 9th, 4 days after Kayla's kindergarten graduation, the family receives an anonymous tip.
The tipster tells them he got the number from this flyer that was posted around the city, and they should go check out this abandoned home on the west side of Detroit.
The tipster provided an address, but no other details.
Alicia's family races to the abandoned house.
We called the police, but we beat them there.
At that point, they weren't about to wait.
We pulled the boards off the house.
Despite the boards, the abandoned house shows signs of activity.
You could tell that, you know, probably squatters had been in the house.
Alicia!
As they approached the basement stairs, Alicia's uncle held everybody else back.
Stay right here, stay right here.
There was this really eerie feeling.
While the rest of the family waits upstairs, Alicia's uncle descends into the basement.
I remember my uncle just yelling up the stairs, there's something down here. We ran downstairs.
He found an old door lying on top of something wrapped in a tarp.
He lifted the door up and pulled the tarp back.
there is a dead body in the basement.
Alicia Fox's loved ones have spent 4 anxious days combing the streets of Detroit for the missing mother, her husband Aaron, and their 2 children. But now an anonymous tip has brought their frantic search to a devastating end.
The family went to an abandoned house and found a body in the basement.
It was Alicia. I knew that it was her. She had on her favorite purple basketball shorts.
At that point, it was too late. Everyone knew that Alicia was dead.
That day was just rough.
Outside the house, Alicia's uncle calls the police, while her sister contacts the father of Alicia's daughter.
I remember telling him, we had found her.
He's at the abandoned house within minutes, before the police even arrive.
He ran in, because he couldn't believe it. He had to see it for himself. All I remember thinking is, right now, he's terrified about the safety of his daughter.
Police and homicide detectives get to the scene soon after.
Homicide investigators respond to the scene. Even if the cause of death is not known, it is a suspicious death.
Any sign of the kids? No, nothing.
After speaking with the officer, detectives see what potential clues they can uncover from Alicia's remains.
A quick examination of the body confirmed that they were dealing with a homicide.
Alicia had been shot 6 times with 2 shots to the head.
However, that's not the only injury Alicia suffered.
It also appears, while trying to dispose of her body, Alicia's killer tried to sever her legs.
It was a very graphic scene.
Whoever did this to Alicia had to be a sick, deranged individual.
It's also evident to detectives that Alicia's murder had occurred well before the family reported her missing.
The body was in a state of decomposition, and it was determined that Alicia had been in the basement possibly more than 4 days.
In fact, police think she might have been killed not long after the family last saw her 2 weeks ago.
But officers don't locate any other bodies inside the house.
Where is Aaron Justice? Where are the children?
Could they still be alive?
Only one thing is certain. The family's search is far from over.
I was just trying my best to be strong for everybody, because as much as I wanted to or needed to mourn, I knew that there was still going to be a job to be done.
While the family clings to hope, the detectives have to consider a different possibility.
Maybe Aaron wasn't the victim. Maybe he was the killer.
Is that why Alicia's body was the only one in the house? Could Aaron have killed her and ran off with the kids?
Quietly, the detectives decide to do a little digging into Aaron.
They find out he has some very serious charges in his rap sheet.
Aaron had weapons possession charges and a prior domestic violence assault.
That's definitely a red flag.
That type of behavior can escalate. And the one thing about domestic abuse, it can escalate quickly, and it can go places we never wanted to go.
When the detectives follow up with her family, they all say Alicia and Aaron's marriage seemed fine.
Anytime I talked to Alicia about their relationship, it was always something positive.
For the most part, she seemed happy. I thought they were just going through the typical marriage stuff.
Or could there have been more going on than Alicia's family knew?
A lot of the times, Women are hiding what happens. So to the outside world, they're thinking, hey, you guys have a perfect relationship, you look good, and they don't know what's going on behind closed doors.
The first indication of trouble comes when a friend of Aaron's reaches out to detectives.
He tells the police Aaron had confided in him that Alicia and him were fighting all the time.
He said she was talking about getting a divorce.
This could be a clear motive that he would try to harm her.
But it's what the man says next that really grabs the detective's attention.
Aaron texted him a picture of a gun and asked him, did he want to buy it?
When was that?
Last Saturday,
31st.
I guess.
That was only a few days before Alicia went missing, likely right after she had been killed.
Was Aaron trying to get rid of a murder weapon?
Detectives investigating the murder of 27-year-old Alicia Fox have learned that shortly after someone shot her 6 times, her husband, Aaron Justice, was trying to sell a .40 caliber handgun.
That would lead an investigator to wonder if the ballistics on that gun would be matched to what was found at the scene where Alicia was discovered.
To prove that it was the murder weapon, they would need to get their hands on the gun.
Did you buy the gun?
Nah, I don't get involved in that kind of stuff.
It's a disappointment for detectives, but Aaron's friend does share some other potentially valuable information.
Aaron may have been having an affair.
That might have been possibly why she wanted to divorce him.
It definitely is a betrayal of emotion, of security, of family.
She would have never wanted that going on in front of her kids.
The fact that Alicia and Aaron's marriage may have been in trouble is news to her family.
I was pretty surprised when I found out. There wasn't something where I felt like, oh, they're on the verge of getting a divorce.
I thought that she was in love and happy.
We see it a lot. It's hush-hush behind closed doors, and nobody in the family really knows how bad it is.
The suspicion surrounding Aaron only grows once the family hears rumors that he is alive and well.
According to the rumors, he was in Atlanta.
At that point, somebody in the family blurted out, he's running.
When detectives learn that Aaron may be in Atlanta, they work to track him down.
They're hopeful with finding him that the children will be with him.
They start their search by obtaining a subpoena for Aaron's cell phone records.
Almost everyone has a cell phone, and cell phone signals can be traced.
After confirming that Aaron was in Atlanta, the detectives contacted the FBI.
There was a warrant issued for Aaron's arrest.
It wasn't long for federal agents to find him and track him down and bring him into custody.
Unfortunately, when they made the arrest, there was no sign of Kayla or Christian.
With Aaron in custody, investigators waste no time getting him into an interrogation room.
I had immense hope that the police were going to be able to get a location of the children out of him.
But when questioned, Aaron has little to say.
Everybody wants to know where the kids are. I don't know where they are.
He played dumb the entire time, like he had no idea what happened to Alicia or the kids.
I got nothing to talk about. Why not, though? You should. You should have a whole lot to say. You should be telling us who you gave your kids to. I'm telling you, like a man, I don't know where they are.
Aaron not only denied knowing anything about the location of the kids, he also denied being involved in Alicia's murder.
Yeah, we know Alicia's dead.
Because we found her. That's a given. You killed Alicia.
No.
Aaron said that the last time he saw Alicia, she was alive and angry.
He told the officer she put me out, she asked me for a divorce.
That confirmed some of what the detectives had heard from their friends.
But they won't get confirmation on anything else.
You gonna take this to the grave?
Take what to the grave?
Everything.
No, I don't know everything.
Your guilt? You gonna take your guilt to the grave, man?
I don't guilt. I ain't know.
Investigators tried very hard, but he still didn't give up any meaningful information.
Killed your wife. I know that for sure. My biggest issue, and I would like to know where that child is at.
The fact that you're still holding on to where the kids are, that is like pure evil.
You tell me where you placed them.
I didn't place them nowhere.
You had them last.
Here we go with you.
Here we go with you. I'm not the one wearing the green little jumpsuit. You are.
However, while Aaron is in custody, it's unclear if prosecutors will be able to put him away for good.
The evidence against Aaron was entirely circumstantial at this point.
With Aaron stonewalling detectives and no new leads coming in, it looks like the case may come apart. Until Alicia's sister gets an unexpected tip about a friend of Aaron's named Timothy Jones.
I got a call from someone who knew Timothy, and they told me that Timothy had been going around the neighborhood telling people that Aaron killed Alicia, and he paid him to hide the body.
As soon as she's off the phone with the informant, Alicia's sister contacts the lead detective.
I let him know what they're telling me, and within like a day or so, they had picked Timothy up.
As soon as the detective sat Tim down for questioning, he broke down.
Did a really bad thing.
Detectives investigating Alicia Fox's murder and the disappearance of her 2 children are following up on a tip that a man named Timothy Jones may be involved.
Timothy was an old friend of Aaron's.
They had reason to believe Tim may know something about what happened to Alicia. Therefore, they bring Tim in and interview him.
Tim tells police Aaron called him to come over for Memorial Day weekend and help out with something. They've been friends forever, so he didn't think much of it.
But when I got there, something just seemed off.
Aaron was really upset, and he basically admitted that he had just shot his wife.
Did he say why?
Said they got in a fight.
Aaron told him that Alicia said that she wanted a divorce.
It's over, Aaron.
Over?
Yes.
Oh, I'll show you over.
So, he shot her.
Yeah, I guess. He said he blacked out.
Once he came to, he realized he was holding a gun and Alicia was dead.
Whether Aaron actually did black out or not, Tim says he has little doubt that Aaron did kill Alicia.
Because after confessing, Tim says Aaron asked him to help get rid of the evidence.
Did you?
Yeah, man, I've known him since elementary school.
Tim picked up some shell casings from the gun. He threw them in the sewer.
He says he also helped Aaron load Alicia's body into a rental truck.
That was the same truck that neighbors had seen outside of the house.
Just right over there.
After Tim helped Aaron get rid of the body, he said Aaron paid him
He paid him Alicia's jewelry, which was a pair of Cartier glasses and a watch.
However, Tim says he doesn't know what's become of Alicia's 2 children.
He says when he left Aaron's house that day, the children were still alive.
It appears he is telling the truth.
Detectives had Tim take a polygraph test, and he passed.
Then, detectives take Tim back to the crime scene, where they recover 4 .40 caliber shell casings from the storm drain.
That was the same caliber as the gun that Aaron was trying to sell around the time of the murder.
With the evidence against him piling up, detectives are confident they can now secure a conviction against Aaron Justice. While Aaron sits in the Wayne County Jail awaiting trial, the search for Alicia's missing children continues.
We searched houses and commercial buildings and streets. We even did grid searches of forests and rivers.
Months go by with no trace of Kayla or Christian, and unfortunately, they were never found.
With no bodies and nothing but circumstantial evidence against Aaron, he was never charged with anything regarding their disappearance.
And he won't stand trial for Alicia's murder either.
When trial came and we got to court and the judge told us that he had accepted a plea deal, it was a surprise to everybody.
With Tim set to testify against him, Aaron's attorney probably saw conviction coming.
In September of 2015, Aaron Justice pleads guilty to murder.
When he took the plea deal, I don't remember him showing any kind of emotion or remorse. He was just sitting there, like he just did not care. Like something is really wrong with him. And he's just sitting there, not crying, not looking like he had any remorse for doing this. It made me want to beat the shit out of him, honestly. Just jump over the thing, grab something, and like beat him with it or something. Because it pisses me off and it makes me so angry.
In return for his plea, Aaron is sentenced to between 45 and 80 years in prison.
When most people hear that a defendant received 45 to 80 years, they think it's justice. I don't think that. I don't think that 45 to 80 years of not being able to walk in the free world I don't think it suffices for what he did.
And no amount of prison time can bring back the woman he took away.
Alicia was everything to a lot of people. She was nearly the backbone to my family. She kept a lot of us together, so much so that losing her has kind of changed the dynamic of my family. She was everybody's favorite, and I want people to remember Alicia for her energetic personality and her goofy laugh, and just that she was someone that you can always count on.
Alicia never deserved anything like this. She was just so sweet. She loved everything. And she was definitely a strong woman, for sure.
But most of all, the family wishes the prosecutors would have put one more condition on Aaron's plea deal.
It definitely should have involved him telling us where the kids are. Because, like, he takes the plea deal and then he just goes to prison. But what about the kids? And it makes me really, really angry. Because it's like they think they did their job, but really no, because you still have 2 missing children. We're out here still suffering. Like, we cannot move on.
It is just very troubling that there's a plea deal and he has information, yet it's not being shared. There should never be a plea deal until
July 21st, 1972 began like countless other summer Fridays in Belfast. The sky hung low over the city, a pale blanket of cloud drifting above rows of brick houses blackened by decades of coal smoke. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors. Bus drivers checked their routes. Mothers carried groceries through crowded streets. Office workers glanced at their watches and thought about the weekend waiting just beyond the final hours of the workday. To an outsider, Belfast might have appeared restless but ordinary. To those who lived there, the tension was always present. It lingered in the silence between conversations. It waited at street corners where soldiers stood with rifles slung across their chests. It hid behind boarded windows, behind political slogans painted across concrete walls, behind every cautious glance exchanged between strangers. In 1972, Belfast was a city learning how to live with fear. But even fear has levels. There are the fears people carry every day, fears that become familiar companions. The possibility of violence. The possibility of another bombing somewhere across town. The possibility that someone you know might not come home. Then there are the moments that redefine fear itself. The moments that divide history into before and after. By the end of that Friday afternoon, Belfast would experience one of those moments. Within just 80 minutes, the city would be transformed into a landscape of smoke, shattered glass, twisted steel, and unimaginable grief. 9 people would lose their lives. More than 130 others would be injured. Entire streets would be torn apart. Families would spend desperate hours searching hospitals for loved ones. Emergency responders would race from one explosion to another without knowing where the next blast would strike. And for those caught in the middle of the chaos, time itself would seem to fracture. Minutes would feel like hours. Hours would feel like days. The nightmare would become known as Bloody Friday. But to understand what happened that afternoon, it is necessary to imagine the city not at the moment of the explosions, but in the fragile calm that came before them. Picture Belfast shortly after 2 o'clock. Cars moved through busy intersections. Buses carried passengers toward home. Workers stood outside buildings smoking cigarettes during afternoon breaks. Children wandered through neighborhoods enjoying the freedom of summer. The city breathed. The city moved. The city lived. No one knew that hidden among the traffic were vehicles carrying enormous explosive devices. No one knew that a carefully coordinated operation was already underway. No one knew that phones had begun ringing with warnings that would soon overwhelm authorities struggling to separate genuine threats from confusion and misinformation. And no one knew that in less than 90 minutes, Belfast would become the center of one of the most devastating bombing campaigns in the history of the conflict known as the Troubles. The first signs of disaster were almost invisible. A parked vehicle. A hurried phone call. A message passed from one office to another. A warning received. A warning repeated. A warning questioned. A warning delayed. In ordinary circumstances, a bomb warning might have triggered a focused emergency response. But this was not an ordinary day. The volume of threats arriving across the city created a storm of uncertainty. Reports came from multiple locations. Some were precise. Some were vague. Some were contradictory. Security forces and emergency services suddenly found themselves trapped in a race against time. Where should officers go first? Which warnings were real? Which locations were in immediate danger? Every decision carried enormous consequences. And while those decisions were being made, the clock continued ticking. Across Belfast, people carried on with their routines completely unaware of the calculations unfolding behind the scenes. A woman stepped onto a bus. A shop assistant arranged merchandise in a display window. A construction worker wiped sweat from his forehead. A teenager crossed a busy road. Each person was living an ordinary moment. Each person believed the next few minutes would resemble the minutes before. That assumption would soon be shattered. When the explosions began, they did not arrive as a single catastrophic event. They arrived in waves. One blast. Then another. Then another. Each explosion seemed to announce the next. Shock rippled through neighborhoods before anyone could fully understand what was happening. Windows exploded outward. Walls cracked. Car alarms screamed. Dust filled the air. People who survived the first blast often found themselves running directly into the uncertainty created by the second. Some witnesses would later describe the experience as feeling unreal, as though the city itself were collapsing around them. Others would remember fragments. The smell of smoke. The sound of sirens. A stranger covered in blood. A shoe lying alone on a pavement. A clock frozen at the moment of impact. Trauma has a way of preserving details that seem insignificant to everyone except the people who lived through them. For many Belfast residents, Bloody Friday became a collection of such memories. Not a sequence of events. Not a historical headline. But a series of images burned permanently into their minds. A mother waiting for news. A father searching hospital corridors. A firefighter climbing through rubble. A child staring at destruction too immense to understand. And beneath every image existed the same question. Why? Why had this happened? Why had so many bombs been placed across the city? Why had warnings failed to prevent tragedy? Why had ordinary civilians found themselves caught in the middle of a conflict larger than any one person could control? Those questions would echo for decades. Even today, historians, survivors, former security personnel, journalists, and political figures continue debating what happened on Bloody Friday. Some focus on responsibility. Others focus on failures in communication. Others examine the wider conflict that created the conditions for such violence to occur. Yet beneath every political argument lies a simpler truth. Real people died. Real families suffered. Real lives were permanently altered. That reality is easy to lose when discussing history. Numbers replace names. Statistics replace faces. Dates replace human stories. But on July 21, 1972, every casualty represented an individual life interrupted without warning. A person who woke up expecting an ordinary day. A person who made plans for the evening. A person who never imagined becoming part of history. Perhaps that is what makes Bloody Friday so haunting. The scale of the violence was enormous, yet its consequences were deeply personal. For every destroyed building, there was someone who worked there. For every shattered vehicle, there was someone who drove it. For every life lost, there were parents, children, spouses, friends, and neighbors left behind. The explosions lasted minutes. The grief lasted generations. As smoke rose above Belfast that afternoon, people across the city struggled to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding. Telephone lines became overloaded. Rumors spread faster than facts. Emergency vehicles raced through crowded streets. Hospitals prepared for casualties. Police officers attempted to secure blast sites while new reports of additional bombs continued arriving. The situation evolved so quickly that even those responding to the crisis often possessed only fragments of information. One explosion might be confirmed while another was reported. One area might be evacuated while another remained crowded. One rescue operation might begin while another disaster was already developing somewhere else. Chaos became the defining characteristic of the afternoon. Not organized chaos. Not controlled chaos. Pure chaos. The kind that strips away certainty and replaces it with instinct. The kind that forces ordinary people into extraordinary situations. The kind that leaves scars long after the physical damage has been repaired. Years later, survivors would remember exactly where they were when they heard the first explosion. Much like other defining tragedies throughout history, the event became anchored to memory through location. A street corner. A bus station. An office window. A shop entrance. A family kitchen. Everyone seemed to have a story. Everyone seemed to remember a moment. And every moment formed part of a larger tragedy that would leave a permanent mark on Northern Ireland. Because Bloody Friday was more than a bombing campaign. It was a warning of how far violence could escalate. It was a demonstration of how quickly a city could descend into terror. And it was a moment that forced countless people to confront uncomfortable questions about conflict, ideology, and the human cost of political struggle. The story we are about to explore is not merely the story of bombs and buildings. It is the story of a city trapped between competing identities. A city carrying generations of resentment, fear, loyalty, and anger. A city where politics and daily life had become inseparable. A city standing on the edge of a precipice. And on that July afternoon, Belfast was pushed over the edge. By the time the smoke finally began to clear, the city that existed at 2 o'clock no longer existed. Something had changed. Something irreversible. The streets remained. The buildings that survived still stood. The people who escaped returned home. But the illusion that Belfast had already witnessed the worst of its conflict was gone. In its place remained shattered glass, twisted metal, unanswered questions, and a date that would become etched forever into the history of Northern Ireland. July 21st, 1972. The day Belfast held its breath. The day fear overwhelmed an entire city. The day known simply as Bloody Friday. To understand Bloody Friday, it is necessary to step back from the explosions, the casualties, and the headlines that would eventually circle the world. Long before the smoke drifted over Belfast on July 21st, 1972, the city had already become a battlefield. The bombs did not emerge from nowhere. They were the product of years of division, decades of resentment, and generations of fear passed from parent to child like an unwanted inheritance. Belfast in the early 1970s was a city divided not only by politics but by geography itself. Entire neighborhoods existed as separate worlds. A few streets could mean the difference between feeling safe and feeling hunted. Murals covered walls like declarations of identity. Flags fluttered above housing estates. Curbstones painted in symbolic colors silently announced who belonged and who did not. People learned very young which roads were safe to walk and which roads were best avoided. For many residents, daily life required constant awareness. A surname could reveal religion. An accent could reveal a neighborhood. A school uniform could reveal allegiance. Even casual conversations often carried invisible political weight. The conflict that would become known as the Troubles was not simply a dispute between governments or armed groups. It seeped into ordinary existence. It shaped friendships, marriages, employment opportunities, and futures. It determined where families lived and how they viewed their neighbors. By 1972, Northern Ireland had become one of the most heavily militarized regions in Europe. British soldiers patrolled the streets. Armored vehicles rumbled through residential districts. Security checkpoints appeared on roads and bridges. Search operations became routine. For some communities, soldiers represented protection. For others, they represented occupation. The same uniform could inspire relief in one neighborhood and anger in another. Trust was almost impossible. Suspicion was everywhere. And beneath the surface, violence continued to grow. Bombings, shootings, riots, and reprisals became part of daily news reports. Newspapers carried photographs of funerals so frequently that many readers stopped reacting with surprise. Death became familiar. Not acceptable, but familiar. Yet familiarity with violence can create a dangerous illusion. People begin to believe they understand its limits. They begin to think tomorrow will resemble yesterday. They convince themselves that however terrible things become, there are lines that will not be crossed. Again and again, history proves otherwise. In Belfast, those assumptions were being tested almost every week. The city itself reflected the strain. Factories that had once symbolized industrial pride struggled against uncertainty. Businesses worried about customers avoiding dangerous areas. Investors hesitated. Families considered leaving if they could afford to do so. Those who remained adapted. They learned how to identify the sound of distant gunfire. They learned which rumors deserved attention. They learned how to continue living even while surrounded by instability. Children played football in streets overlooked by military patrols. Couples went on dates despite curfews and security concerns. Workers boarded buses each morning even though nobody could guarantee the journey would be uneventful. Life continued because it had to. But beneath that determination existed exhaustion. Years of tension had worn people down. Every community carried wounds. Every family seemed to know someone who had been injured, arrested, threatened, or killed. And while ordinary citizens tried to navigate daily life, larger political forces continued pulling Northern Ireland toward deeper confrontation. The roots of the conflict stretched back decades. Questions of national identity, sovereignty, religion, and civil rights had created fault lines that grew increasingly difficult to manage. Many Catholics and Irish nationalists felt marginalized and discriminated against within Northern Ireland. Many Protestants and Unionists feared losing their place within the United Kingdom. Both communities carried genuine fears. Both communities possessed historical grievances. Both communities increasingly viewed the future through the lens of survival. In such an environment, moderation became difficult. Compromise often appeared as weakness. Fear amplified anger. Anger amplified division. And division created fertile ground for extremism. The Provisional Irish Republican Army emerged within this atmosphere. To supporters, the organization represented resistance. To opponents, it represented terrorism. To many civilians trapped between competing narratives, it represented another source of uncertainty in lives already overwhelmed by uncertainty. The IRA's campaign sought to challenge British authority in Northern Ireland through armed struggle. Bombings became one of its most visible tactics. Targets frequently included infrastructure, economic assets, and symbols of government authority. Supporters argued such actions were part of a political and military campaign. Critics pointed to the inevitable human consequences. Regardless of perspective, one fact remained undeniable. Every explosion affected ordinary people. A damaged road disrupted workers. A destroyed building eliminated jobs. A bomb warning emptied schools and businesses. Violence never remained confined to its intended targets. The consequences always spread outward. Like ripples moving across water. By 1972, the pace of conflict had accelerated dramatically. That year would become one of the bloodiest periods in the entire history of the Troubles. Deaths mounted. Retaliatory attacks intensified. Communities grew increasingly polarized. Many feared the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Then came January 30th, 1972. A day that would leave a profound scar on Northern Ireland. During a civil rights march in Derry, British soldiers opened fire on demonstrators. 14 civilians ultimately died from their wounds. The event became known as Bloody Sunday. Images and reports spread rapidly. Shock transformed into outrage. For many within the nationalist community, Bloody Sunday became evidence that peaceful protest could no longer achieve meaningful change. Recruitment to Republican organizations reportedly increased. Trust in political solutions deteriorated. The possibility of reconciliation appeared more distant than ever. The months that followed felt increasingly unstable. Violence intensified across Northern Ireland. Every new incident deepened existing wounds. Every funeral reinforced collective grief. Every retaliation created new motivations for future retaliation. The cycle fed itself. Meanwhile, political leaders searched desperately for ways to reduce tensions. Negotiations occurred. Back-channel communications developed. Attempts were made to establish dialogue between opposing sides. For brief moments, there seemed to be opportunities for progress. Tiny openings in an otherwise dark landscape. One of those opportunities emerged during the summer of 1972. Secret contacts and discussions took place between representatives of the British government and the IRA. The possibility of a ceasefire generated cautious hope. Perhaps not optimism, but hope. People wanted an end to the violence. They wanted fewer funerals. They wanted fewer soldiers on the streets. They wanted fewer bombings and fewer shootings. Most of all, they wanted normality. The kind of normality many younger residents had barely experienced. Yet hope is fragile. especially in conflicts built upon decades of distrust. The talks ultimately failed. The reasons remain debated. Different participants offered different interpretations. But the result was clear. The opportunity disappeared. And when that opportunity vanished, frustration returned with greater force. The atmosphere across Belfast became increasingly tense. Political disappointment mixed with anger. Anger mixed with fear. Fear mixed with the expectation that something significant was coming. Few people knew exactly what. Many sensed that events were moving toward another confrontation. What nobody anticipated was the scale of what would occur on July 21st. The city itself seemed unaware of what lay ahead. On the surface, Belfast continued functioning. Buses followed schedules. Shops opened each morning. Factories operated. Schools prepared for summer activities. The rhythms of urban life persisted despite everything. Yet there was something haunting about Belfast during those years. The city often appeared to exist in two realities simultaneously. One reality consisted of ordinary human experiences. Birthday celebrations. Family dinners. Children laughing in parks. Friends sharing drinks after work. The other reality consisted of checkpoints, bomb scares, funerals, political speeches, and violence. Both realities occupied the same streets. Sometimes they existed only minutes apart. A family could enjoy lunch together and hear an explosion before dessert. A child could walk past soldiers on the way to school and consider the sight completely normal. That blending of ordinary life and extraordinary danger defined Belfast during the Troubles. It also explains why Bloody Friday would become so shocking. Not because violence was unfamiliar, but because the scale of the violence shattered even the expectations of a population already accustomed to conflict. The city on July 21st was not relaxed. It was not peaceful. But neither was it expecting what was about to happen. People had adapted to a certain level of danger. They had not prepared for a coordinated bombing operation that would strike multiple locations across Belfast within a remarkably short period of time. As the morning hours passed that Friday, workers filled offices throughout the city centre. Delivery vehicles moved between businesses. Passengers waited at transport hubs. Tourists and visitors crossed streets alongside residents who had spent their entire lives in Belfast. The weather was typical of an Irish summer, neither dramatic nor memorable. Nothing in the sky warned of disaster. Nothing in the streets revealed the approaching catastrophe. And yet, hidden within the movement of the city, preparations were already underway. Vehicles carrying explosives were being positioned. Plans developed over weeks and months were approaching execution. Timetables were being followed. Instructions were being carried out. The machinery of violence was quietly moving into place. For those responsible, the operation represented strategy. For those who would later respond to the devastation, it represented catastrophe. For the civilians unknowingly walking toward the danger, it represented something even more tragic. A collision with history. The kind of collision that arrives without warning. The kind that transforms ordinary people into victims, witnesses, survivors, and mourners. As Belfast moved toward the afternoon of July 21st, the city stood on the edge of one of the darkest days in its modern history. Most residents did not know it. Perhaps that is the most chilling aspect of all. The people who would soon find themselves running from explosions, searching through smoke, or waiting desperately for news of loved ones began that day exactly as they had begun countless others. They drank tea. They boarded buses. They went to work. They made plans for dinner. They worried about bills, children, jobs, and ordinary concerns. None of them knew that within a matter of hours, Belfast itself would become the story. And when the first explosion finally shattered the afternoon, it would not simply mark the beginning of a bombing campaign. It would mark the moment an already wounded city discovered just how much deeper its wounds could become. One of the greatest challenges when telling the story of Bloody Friday is deciding who the victim was. In many true crime cases, the answer is simple. A single name. A single face. A single life cut short. Bloody Friday is different. The tragedy spread across an entire city. The bombs did not choose one victim. They arrived in different locations, at different times, tearing through the lives of strangers who had never met each other. Some were commuters. Some were workers. Some were members of the security forces. Some were civilians who happened to be standing in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. Their backgrounds were different. Their beliefs were different. Their daily routines were different. Yet on July 21, 1972, their stories became permanently connected. To understand the human cost of Bloody Friday, it is necessary to move away from politics and military strategy. Away from organizations. Away from governments. Away from ideology. Because beneath every headline stood individual people whose lives were unfolding in ordinary ways before violence interrupted them. The victims of Bloody Friday were not symbols. They were human beings. Each one carried memories, ambitions, fears, and relationships. Each one occupied a unique place in the lives of others. And when they disappeared, empty spaces remained behind. Spaces that could never truly be filled. Across Belfast that summer, thousands of people shared similar routines. Men left for work before breakfast. Women balanced jobs, household responsibilities, and family obligations. Children explored neighborhoods during school holidays. Teenagers imagined futures larger than the city surrounding them. The conflict was always present, but life continued. People still celebrated birthdays. People still planned weddings. People still argued about money, worried about exams, dreamed about careers, and hoped for better days. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to continue living even in difficult circumstances. That resilience was visible everywhere in Belfast. Many residents had spent years adapting to instability. They learned to navigate checkpoints. They learned to recognize danger. They learned how to continue building lives despite uncertainty. But resilience has limits. No amount of adaptation can fully prepare someone for an explosion. No amount of experience can guarantee survival when violence erupts without warning. Among the names forever linked to Bloody Friday, one would come to occupy a particularly emotional place in public memory. Stephen Parker was only 14 years old. 14. An age suspended between childhood and adulthood. An age when the future feels endless. An age when most concerns revolve around friends, school, hobbies, and dreams not yet fully formed. Stephen was not a soldier. He was not a politician. He was not involved in military operations. He was a teenager living in a city consumed by conflict. Like countless young people throughout history, he happened to be growing up in circumstances he did not create. On that July afternoon, Stephen encountered a situation that demanded a choice. Most adults faced with danger instinctively move away from it. That instinct exists for a reason. It protects life. It encourages survival. Yet there are moments when some individuals act differently. Moments when concern for others overcomes fear. Moments when courage appears not as a grand speech or dramatic gesture but as a simple decision. A decision made in seconds. A decision that reveals character. Accounts from the day indicate that Stephen became aware of the danger posed by a bomb and attempted to warn people nearby. He moved toward risk rather than away from it. He acted while others remained unaware. And in doing so, he lost his life. His death became one of the most heartbreaking stories associated with Bloody Friday because it embodied a painful contradiction. In the middle of a day defined by destruction, a young boy demonstrated extraordinary concern for strangers. While violence threatened innocent lives, he tried to save them. While fear spread through the city, he acted. His story would endure because it reminded people that even during the darkest moments, humanity remains visible. But Stephen was not alone. Other victims also carried stories that deserved to be remembered. The problem is that history often compresses lives into statistics. 9 dead. 130 injured. Those numbers are accurate. Yet they are also incomplete. Numbers cannot describe the silence inside a family home after a loved one fails to return. Numbers cannot explain what it feels like to wait beside a telephone, hoping for news. Numbers cannot capture the expression on a mother's face when hope slowly begins to disappear. Behind every casualty stood a network of relationships. Parents, children, brothers, sisters, friends, neighbors, co-workers. The blast waves that tore through Belfast damaged more than buildings. They shattered countless personal worlds. Imagine a woman preparing dinner while waiting for her husband to come home from work. The hours pass. The news grows increasingly alarming. Reports of explosions spread across the city. At first she assumes he is delayed. Traffic must be terrible. Roads are probably closed. Perhaps he stopped to help someone. Perhaps he simply cannot reach a telephone. Then another hour passes. Then another. Anxiety begins replacing patience. Every knock at the door becomes significant. Every ringing phone triggers hope and fear simultaneously. Thousands of families experienced some version of that emotional journey during Bloody Friday. Some received reassuring news. Others did not. For hospital staff, the day became a race against overwhelming demand. Doctors and nurses confronted a steady flow of casualties. Injuries ranged from minor wounds to catastrophic trauma. Medical professionals accustomed to emergency situations suddenly found themselves working inside an expanding disaster. Every patient represented an urgent problem. Every minute mattered. Decisions had to be made quickly. Resources had to be allocated. Lives depended upon efficiency. Yet even within the pressure and exhaustion, moments of humanity persisted. A hand held. A reassuring word. A family member guided through a corridor. Small acts of compassion became lifelines in an environment dominated by fear. The injured victims carried their own burdens. Some survived with visible wounds. Others carried invisible scars. Trauma does not always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it arrives later. Days later. Months later. Years later. A loud noise. A familiar street. The smell of smoke. A sudden memory. For many survivors, Bloody Friday never truly ended. The explosions lasted only minutes. The psychological consequences stretched across decades. Children who witnessed the destruction grew into adults who still remembered specific details. The shape of shattered glass. The color of smoke. The expressions of people running through the streets. Memory preserved fragments long after physical evidence disappeared. And then there were the families of those who never came home. Grief has a strange relationship with time. The world continues moving. New headlines appear. New crises emerge. New generations grow up. But for grieving families, certain moments remain frozen. A birthday that never arrives. An empty chair at Christmas. A familiar voice that exists only in memory. For them, Bloody Friday was not simply a historical event. It was a permanent dividing line. Life before. Life after. Nothing in between. One of the cruelest aspects of mass casualty events is how random they often feel. People survive because they arrive late. Others die because they arrive early. One person chooses a different route home. Another follows a familiar path. Tiny decisions become matters of life and death. Looking back, it becomes tempting to search for meaning in those coincidences. To imagine that fate was somehow involved. But the reality is often more painful. Ordinary people become victims because violence does not care about their plans, their families, or their futures. It simply arrives. And when it does, lives change forever. The victims of Bloody Friday represented different communities within Northern Ireland. Their backgrounds varied. Their beliefs varied. Their experiences varied. Yet death erased those distinctions. Grief crossed political boundaries. Pain crossed religious boundaries. Loss crossed ideological boundaries. Families mourning loved ones rarely find comfort in political arguments. They mourn the person, not the narrative. They remember birthdays, conversations, habits, and laughter. They remember what was lost. That is why the victims matter. Not as symbols. Not as statistics. But as reminders of the human cost hidden beneath historical events. When historians discuss Bloody Friday, they often focus on strategy, consequences, and political impact. Those subjects are important. They help explain what happened. But explanation is not the same as understanding. True understanding begins with recognizing the people whose lives were interrupted by the violence. The workers who never finished their shifts. The commuters who never completed their journeys. The families whose futures changed forever. The teenager who tried to warn others and paid the ultimate price. Together, they form the human heart of this story. Because before Bloody Friday became a chapter in history books, it was a day experienced by real people. People who laughed that morning. People who made plans for the weekend. People who expected tomorrow to arrive. Some never saw that tomorrow. Others survived and carried the memories forward. And as Belfast moved closer to the afternoon that would define an era, none of them knew they were about to become part of one of the most devastating days in the history of the Troubles. They were simply living their lives. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic truth of all. July 21, 1972. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Belfast was still moving through what appeared to be an ordinary summer day. Traffic flowed through the city centre. Office workers glanced at clocks and calculated how many hours remained before the weekend. Bus stations remained crowded with passengers arriving and departing. Storefront windows reflected the movement of shoppers along busy streets. Nothing about the scene suggested that Belfast was only minutes away from one of the most devastating coordinated bombing attacks in its history. Yet hidden among the traffic and routine activity, a deadly operation was already unfolding. Vehicles loaded with explosives had been positioned across multiple locations. The plan depended upon timing. The plan depended upon confusion. Most importantly, the plan depended upon overwhelming the ability of authorities to respond. At approximately 2:10 p.m., the first stage of the nightmare began. Across Belfast, telephone warnings started reaching newspapers, security forces, and emergency services. The messages described bombs placed in different locations. Some warnings included specific details. Others were less precise. Every call demanded immediate attention. Every call carried the possibility of mass casualties. But there was a problem. The number of warnings arriving in such a short period created chaos. Officers attempted to verify locations. Emergency crews tried to determine priorities. Resources were stretched across an expanding list of potential targets. One team headed toward one warning while another warning arrived somewhere else. The city was becoming a giant puzzle with missing pieces. No one could see the entire picture. And while authorities struggled to interpret the information, the countdown continued. Then the explosions began. The first blast shattered the afternoon with a force that echoed through surrounding streets. Glass erupted outward. Concrete cracked. People instinctively ducked or froze. For a brief moment, confusion dominated everything. Many residents had heard explosions before. Bombings were tragically familiar during the Troubles. But this felt different. Almost immediately, reports emerged that another explosion had occurred elsewhere. Then another. Then another. What initially appeared to be a single incident rapidly revealed itself as something far larger. The city was under attack. At location after location, explosive devices detonated with devastating force. Oxford Street became one of the central scenes of horror. The busy transport hub was filled with the ordinary movement of urban life when disaster struck. Passengers moved between vehicles. Workers carried out routine responsibilities. Pedestrians passed nearby without any reason to suspect danger. Then, in an instant, normality disappeared. The explosion tore through the area with tremendous violence. The blast wave slammed into buildings and vehicles. Windows shattered across a wide radius. Debris became deadly projectiles. People were thrown to the ground. Others found themselves trapped beneath wreckage. The air filled with dust so thick that visibility vanished. Those who survived often struggled to understand what had happened. One moment they had been standing in a functioning city. The next they were surrounded by destruction. The scene resembled a battlefield. Smoke drifted upward. Pieces of twisted metal littered the streets. Human cries emerged from the chaos. Some shouted for help. Some called the names of loved ones. Some simply screamed. Emergency responders rushed toward the devastation, but even as they did, new reports of explosions continued arriving from other parts of Belfast. The nightmare was multiplying. Smithfield bus station was also struck. Elsewhere, bombs targeted roads, bridges, commercial areas, and transportation infrastructure. The operation appeared designed not only to cause damage but to paralyze the city itself. Every new explosion created additional confusion. Every new emergency stretched resources further. Police officers arriving at one scene learned another blast had occurred elsewhere. Ambulances transporting casualties received reports of fresh victims. Command structures struggled to keep pace with events developing faster than information could travel. For civilians, the experience felt surreal. People emerging from one blast area sometimes believed the danger had passed. Then another explosion would shake the city. Nobody knew where the next detonation might occur. Nobody knew whether a reported warning was genuine. Nobody knew if they were safe. Fear spread faster than smoke. Across Belfast, rumors traveled through streets, workplaces, and homes. Some reports were accurate. Others were not. People heard that multiple bombs had exploded. Then they heard there were more still waiting. Families attempted to contact relatives. Telephone networks became overwhelmed. Information arrived in fragments. A mother heard there had been an explosion near her son's workplace. A husband learned that his wife's bus route passed through an affected area. Friends searched hospitals looking for familiar faces. The uncertainty became its own form of suffering. Not knowing. Waiting. Hoping. Fearing. Meanwhile, emergency crews confronted conditions unlike anything many had ever experienced. Firefighters raced from location to location. Police attempted to secure dangerous areas. Medical teams treated casualties in streets, vehicles, and overwhelmed facilities. Everywhere there seemed to be another emergency. Another injured person. Another report. Another crisis. Yet amid the confusion, acts of courage emerged. Ordinary civilians helped strangers climb from rubble. Drivers transported injured victims when ambulances were delayed. Shopkeepers opened doors to provide shelter. People who moments earlier had been complete strangers suddenly became rescuers. Disaster often reveals the worst and best aspects of humanity simultaneously. Bloody Friday proved no exception. Among the most heartbreaking events of the day was the death of 14-year-old Stephen Parker. As panic spread through parts of the city, Stephen reportedly became aware of a bomb threat and attempted to warn others. Instead of thinking only about his own safety, he focused on protecting people around him. It was a remarkable act for anyone. It was extraordinary coming from a teenager. Then the bomb exploded. The blast ended his life. In a day filled with tragedy, Stephen's death carried a particular emotional weight. His story represented innocence caught in the path of violence. It represented courage in the face of danger. And it represented the devastating reality that conflict often claims those who have no role in creating it. As the afternoon continued, Belfast descended deeper into crisis. Sirens echoed continuously. Roads became clogged. Smoke columns rose above different districts. Journalists scrambled to understand what was happening. Hospitals filled with casualties. Families searched for information. Authorities attempted to regain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. The scale of the operation was becoming clear. More than 20 bombs had exploded across the city within roughly 80 minutes. The sheer number created conditions that made effective emergency response extraordinarily difficult. Even when warnings had been received, responding to all of them simultaneously proved nearly impossible. Security forces later argued that the volume of threats overwhelmed available resources. Critics questioned whether more could have been done. Supporters of the operation pointed toward the warnings that had been issued. Opponents pointed toward the dead and injured. Those debates would continue for decades. But on the afternoon itself, the argument seemed distant compared to the immediate reality unfolding in Belfast streets. People were bleeding. People were trapped. People were dying. Politics offered little comfort in those moments. As rescue operations expanded, responders encountered scenes that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Broken glass covered pavements. Vehicles had been transformed into mangled wrecks. Storefronts stood shattered. Walls bore scars from blast pressure and flying debris. Personal belongings lay scattered everywhere. A handbag. A shoe. A briefcase. A child's possession. Ordinary objects suddenly disconnected from their owners. Small reminders that every casualty had been a person living an ordinary life moments before disaster struck. By late afternoon, the city was struggling to absorb what had happened. The full casualty count remained unclear. Reports continued arriving. Hospitals remained busy. Police maintained cordons around damaged locations. Journalists gathered witness accounts. And throughout Belfast, families waited for confirmation that loved ones were safe. For some, those confirmations came. For others, they never would. As daylight slowly moved toward evening, the true scale of Bloody Friday began emerging. 9 people were dead. Approximately 130 others had been injured. Entire sections of the city had suffered extensive damage. But statistics alone could not communicate the emotional devastation. Behind every casualty stood grieving relatives. Behind every injury stood trauma. Behind every destroyed location stood memories and livelihoods. The bombs had lasted only 80 minutes. The consequences would last generations. When Belfast awoke that morning, it was already a city burdened by conflict. When the sun began setting on July 21st, it was something else entirely. A city shocked by the realization that even after years of violence, the boundaries of horror had not yet been reached. Bloody Friday had arrived. And by the time the final smoke drifted away from the shattered streets, Belfast would never look at itself in quite the same way again. The explosions ended long before the work of understanding them began. As the final blast echoes faded across Belfast, another phase of the tragedy emerged from the smoke and confusion. For emergency responders, investigators, journalists, and grieving families, the afternoon was far from over. In many ways, the most difficult hours were only beginning. The city looked wounded. Entire sections of Belfast appeared as though they had been struck by artillery rather than bombs hidden inside ordinary vehicles. Streets that had been crowded with commuters and shoppers less than 2 hours earlier now resembled disaster zones. Glass-covered pavements in glittering layers. Storefronts stood hollow and broken. Cars sat twisted beside roads, their frames bent and blackened. The smell lingered everywhere. Smoke. Dust. Burned metal. Fuel. The scent of destruction hung over the city like an invisible cloud. Emergency crews continued moving through the affected areas searching for survivors and assisting the injured. Firefighters climbed over unstable debris. Police officers established security cordons. Ambulance personnel worked with relentless urgency. Yet beneath the visible chaos existed another challenge. Nobody knew the full scope of what had happened. Not yet. The attack had been so widespread, so rapid, and so confusing that information remained fragmented. Reports continued arriving from multiple locations. Some details proved accurate. Others turned out to be mistaken. Investigators faced an enormous task. Before they could determine responsibility, motives, or planning, they first needed to understand the crime scene. The problem was that there was not one crime scene. There were many. Each blast site possessed its own damage pattern, its own witnesses, its own casualties, its own physical evidence. And each location demanded immediate attention. Oxford Street quickly became one of the primary focuses of investigators. The destruction there was severe. The transport hub had absorbed one of the deadliest explosions of the day, leaving behind a landscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. Rescue personnel carefully searched through damaged areas while investigators began documenting every detail they could find. Photographs were taken. Measurements recorded. Fragments collected. Every piece of debris potentially carried information. In modern criminal investigations, forensic science often relies upon sophisticated technology. In 1972, investigators worked with far fewer tools. Much depended upon patience, observation, and experience. They studied blast patterns. They examined vehicle remains. They attempted to reconstruct events from physical damage. The shape of destruction could reveal surprising details. The direction of shattered glass. The angle of impact marks. The distribution of debris. Each clue helped build a picture of what had occurred. At Oxford Street, that picture was horrifying. The force of the explosion had radiated outward with devastating efficiency. Nearby structures bore evidence of immense pressure. Vehicles had been thrown aside. Human victims had suffered catastrophic injuries. Investigators understood immediately that they were dealing with a large explosive device. Elsewhere across Belfast, similar scenes unfolded. At each location, teams worked methodically despite overwhelming circumstances. The challenge was not merely collecting evidence. The challenge was preserving evidence while rescue operations remained active. Lives still needed saving. Medical teams still required access. Heavy equipment sometimes had to move debris. Every action risked disturbing valuable clues. Balancing rescue efforts with investigative needs became a constant struggle. Witnesses soon emerged as another crucial source of information. Hundreds of people had been present across the various blast sites. Some had seen suspicious vehicles. Others remembered unusual activity before the explosions. Many had observed nothing at all. Trauma affects memory in complex ways. Certain details become extraordinarily vivid. Others vanish completely. Investigators quickly learned that no two accounts sounded exactly alike. One witness remembered a parked car. Another remembered hearing shouting moments before an explosion. A third recalled a man walking quickly away from a location. Separating useful information from confusion became a painstaking process. The difficulty increased because fear remained widespread. Many residents worried about speaking openly. Some feared retaliation. Others simply distrusted authorities. The political divisions that defined Northern Ireland complicated every aspect of the investigation. Even gathering basic information could become challenging when communities viewed institutions through very different lenses. Meanwhile, police communication centers struggled to organize the flood of incoming reports. Telephone calls arrived continuously. Witnesses provided observations. Families searched for relatives. Journalists requested updates. Officials exchanged information between departments. The volume was staggering. Investigators worked long hours attempting to construct a coherent timeline from scattered fragments. When exactly had each warning been received? Who had received it? How much information had been provided? When had authorities responded? These questions quickly became central to understanding the day's events. Almost immediately, controversy began emerging around the warnings. The organization responsible for the bombings maintained that advance warnings had been issued. Authorities acknowledged receiving warnings but argued that the unprecedented number of threats created impossible conditions. Investigators found themselves caught in the middle of a debate that would persist for decades. On paper, the warnings existed. In reality, dozens of threats arriving within a compressed timeframe generated enormous confusion. Resources were limited. Personnel were limited. Time was limited. Even if every warning had been genuine and accurately communicated, Responding effectively to all of them simultaneously presented extraordinary challenges. Yet for grieving families, such explanations offered little comfort. When someone loses a loved one, questions naturally follow. Could more have been done? Could lives have been saved? Could authorities have acted faster? Could better decisions have prevented tragedy? These questions haunted many people after Bloody Friday. Some would spend years searching for answers. Others would spend years arguing over them. The investigation itself gradually revealed evidence of significant planning behind the operation. This had not been an impulsive act. The coordination required to position multiple bombs across Belfast within a short time frame suggested careful preparation. Vehicles had been acquired. Explosives had been assembled. Targets had been selected. Schedules had been established. Participants had carried out specific roles. The complexity of the operation became increasingly apparent as investigators analyzed the available evidence. At the same time, journalists worked to document the human impact. Photographers captured images of shattered buildings and damaged vehicles. Reporters interviewed survivors and emergency responders. Newspapers prepared front-page stories that would carry news of the bombings far beyond Belfast. The images proved especially powerful. A damaged city. Smoke rising from urban streets. Rescue workers searching through debris. Families waiting anxiously for information. The photographs transformed the scale of the tragedy into something visible. Something impossible to ignore. As evening approached, hospitals remained crowded. Doctors continued treating injuries. Families gathered in waiting rooms. Some prayed. Some cried. Some sat in silence. The emotional atmosphere inside medical facilities reflected the broader mood across Belfast. Exhaustion. Shock. Grief. Disbelief. For many people, the reality of what had happened still felt difficult to process. The sheer number of explosions challenged comprehension. One bombing was terrible. 2 bombings were shocking. More than 20 explosions occurring across a city in roughly 80 minutes seemed almost unimaginable. Yet the evidence surrounded them. Broken windows. Collapsed structures. Funeral preparations already beginning. As investigators reviewed the emerging casualty figures, another grim reality became clear. The victims represented different backgrounds and affiliations. Among the dead were civilians, members of security forces, and individuals connected to opposing sides of the conflict. The bombs had not respected political boundaries. The suffering reached across communities. This fact complicated simplistic narratives. Violence often encourages people to divide the world into opposing camps. Bloody Friday resisted such easy categorization. The dead included people who otherwise might never have shared anything in common. In death, they became part of the same tragedy. Throughout the night, investigators continued examining evidence. Maps covered tables. Reports accumulated. Witness statements expanded. Timelines grew more detailed. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The attack appeared designed not merely to damage infrastructure but to overwhelm response systems. The concentration of explosions within a limited period created conditions in which authorities struggled to react effectively. This understanding would become one of the defining conclusions drawn from the investigation. The operation's success depended partly upon confusion. And confusion had certainly been achieved. Still, many questions remained unanswered. Who had participated directly? How had the operation been coordinated? What decisions had been made regarding targets and timing? Could casualties have been reduced? Were there mistakes in execution? These uncertainties would shape future inquiries and public debate. For ordinary residents, however, the investigation often felt distant compared to immediate concerns. They wanted to know whether loved ones were safe. They wanted to repair damaged homes and businesses. They wanted reassurance that another wave of bombs was not coming. Most of all, they wanted to make sense of what they had witnessed. Yet making sense of Bloody Friday proved difficult. The destruction was visible. The consequences were visible. The motivations behind it seemed far more complicated. As darkness settled over Belfast, floodlights illuminated damaged areas. Police officers maintained security. Investigators continued working. Reporters filed stories. Ambulances moved between hospitals. The city remained awake long after sunset. Too much had happened. Too many lives had been changed. Too many questions demanded answers. In the days ahead, the search for those answers would intensify. Political leaders would issue statements. Communities would react. Arguments would emerge regarding responsibility, warnings, and consequences. But on that first night, standing amid shattered streets and broken glass, investigators confronted a simpler truth. Bloody Friday had left behind one of the largest and most complex crime scenes Northern Ireland had ever seen. And somewhere within the wreckage lay the clues that would explain how an entire city had been brought to its knees in just 80 minutes. In most true crime stories, the investigation eventually narrows. Detectives begin with dozens of possibilities, then eliminate one suspect after another until a single name remains. Bloody Friday was different. From the very beginning, investigators were not trying to discover whether a crime had occurred. The crime had unfolded in full view of an entire city. The explosions had been heard across Belfast. The damage was undeniable. The casualties were real. The challenge was understanding how such a large operation had been organized, who had participated directly, what decisions had been made behind the scenes, and whether any opportunities existed to prevent a similar catastrophe from happening again. Unlike a conventional murder investigation, Bloody Friday unfolded against the backdrop of an ongoing conflict. That reality complicated everything. Every witness statement existed within a politically charged environment. Every piece of evidence entered a landscape already crowded with competing narratives. Every conclusion risked being interpreted through the lens of ideology rather than fact. Investigators quickly understood they were not simply examining a bombing campaign. They were examining one of the most significant events in an active insurgency. Within hours of the attack, responsibility was broadly understood. The Provisional IRA had already become one of the central actors in the Troubles, and the scale and nature of the operation pointed strongly toward its involvement. Yet identifying organizational responsibility and identifying individual participants were two very different challenges. The organization itself functioned through secrecy. Cells operated with limited knowledge of one another. Compartmentalization reduced the risk that any single arrest could expose an entire operation. Those structures made investigations extraordinarily difficult. Witnesses had seen vehicles. Witnesses had seen people. But seeing a person near a parked car and proving participation in a coordinated bombing campaign were entirely different matters. Across Belfast, detectives began reviewing reports from every blast location. Patterns emerged. Timelines were compared. Vehicle descriptions were collected. Phone warnings were analyzed. The operation had displayed a remarkable degree of coordination. That coordination became one of the most important clues. Large-scale attacks require planning. Planning requires communication. Communication leaves traces. At least in theory. In practice, uncovering those traces proved far more difficult. Many of the individuals involved had disappeared long before the bombs exploded. Vehicles had been abandoned. Routes had been carefully selected. False leads mixed with genuine observations. Investigators found themselves navigating a maze filled with dead ends. One witness believed he had seen suspicious activity near a vehicle shortly before an explosion. Another remembered someone behaving nervously. A third described individuals moving quickly away from a location. Each statement appeared potentially significant. Each statement generated investigative leads. Yet many ultimately produced nothing conclusive. Memory is fragile. Especially during traumatic events. People often become convinced they remember details clearly. Later examination sometimes reveals inconsistencies. Times become distorted. Distances become inaccurate. Faces blend together. Investigators repeatedly encountered this problem. Information that initially seemed promising often dissolved under closer scrutiny. The sheer scale of the attack created another obstacle. More than 20 explosions meant more than 20 separate collections of witnesses, evidence, timelines, and reports. Each location generated paperwork. Each location demanded resources. Each location required attention. The amount of information became overwhelming. As days passed, political pressure intensified. The public wanted answers. Families wanted accountability. Government officials wanted explanations. Journalists wanted details. Everyone asked similar questions. Who planned Bloody Friday? Who approved it? Who carried it out? Why had so many bombs been deployed simultaneously? Could the deaths have been avoided? Those questions dominated conversations throughout Northern Ireland. Yet answers remained frustratingly incomplete. Part of the difficulty stemmed from the unique nature of the troubles themselves. Traditional criminal investigations often rely upon cooperation between communities and law enforcement. In Belfast during 1972, such cooperation could not be assumed. Many neighborhoods viewed authorities with suspicion. Some residents feared retaliation if they shared information. Others believed speaking with police would mark them as informers. Silence became a form of self-protection. Investigators encountered doors that remained closed. Conversations that ended quickly. Witnesses who suddenly remembered nothing. Fear influenced every aspect of the investigation. Not only fear of violence. Fear of consequences. Fear of being identified. Fear of choosing the wrong side in a conflict that increasingly demanded loyalty. Meanwhile, debates surrounding the bomb warnings continued growing louder. This issue became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire event. According to the IRA, warnings had been provided before the explosions. According to security forces, the volume and complexity of the warnings created impossible operational conditions. Both sides defended their positions. Both sides pointed toward evidence supporting their claims. For investigators, the challenge was separating rhetoric from reality. Records showed warnings had indeed been received. The problem was determining whether they had been sufficiently precise, sufficiently timely, and sufficiently manageable. Imagine receiving a single warning regarding a single bomb. The response might appear straightforward. Now imagine receiving multiple warnings concerning multiple locations across an entire city. Imagine trying to determine which threat demands immediate attention. Imagine making those decisions while the clock counts down toward detonation. That was the reality authorities faced. The investigation revealed a system overwhelmed by volume. Not necessarily by indifference. Not necessarily by incompetence. By volume. Too many warnings. Too many locations. Too little time. Yet acknowledging those realities did not eliminate criticism. For grieving relatives, explanations about logistics rarely eased pain. Every family naturally wondered whether different decisions might have saved lives. That question lingered over the investigation like a shadow. As weeks turned into months, investigators expanded their focus beyond the immediate bombings. They began examining the broader context surrounding the operation. What strategic objectives had motivated such an unprecedented attack? Why had this moment been chosen? Why had Belfast itself become the target? The answers pointed toward developments that had occurred during the summer of 1972. Secret contacts between the British government and Republican representatives had created hopes for progress. When those efforts collapsed, tensions escalated dramatically. Many analysts later viewed Bloody Friday as partly connected to that breakdown. Not simply an act of violence. A message. A demonstration of capability. A display of operational reach. From that perspective, the bombings served political and military purposes beyond the immediate destruction. Yet such strategic interpretations raised uncomfortable questions. If the operation was intended to communicate strength, what did the civilian casualties communicate? If the objective involved pressure, how would the deaths of ordinary people influence public opinion? Investigators were not political philosophers. Their responsibility involved facts. Yet these larger questions inevitably surrounded their work. Because Bloody Friday existed at the intersection of crime, conflict, politics, and history. No investigation could completely separate those elements. Within Republican circles, reactions to the bombings proved more complicated than outsiders sometimes assumed. While supporters often defended armed struggle in principle, the scale of civilian suffering generated significant discomfort. Some individuals privately questioned whether the operation had gone too far. Others worried about public backlash. Still others argued that responsibility lay elsewhere. These divisions were not always visible publicly, but they existed. And investigators recognized that major events often create fractures even within organizations that appear unified from the outside. For intelligence agencies, Bloody Friday triggered renewed efforts to understand Republican operational structures. Analysts reviewed known personnel. Networks were mapped. Associations were examined. Patterns of activity were studied. The objective extended beyond solving a single case. Authorities wanted to prevent future attacks. That goal required understanding how operations were planned and executed. Yet intelligence work, like criminal investigation, frequently encounters uncertainty. Information arrives incomplete. Sources provide conflicting accounts. Rumors circulate alongside facts. Analysts construct theories only to abandon them later. The process resembles assembling a puzzle while half the pieces remain missing. Bloody Friday produced countless such puzzles. Some were solved. Others never were. As months passed, one conclusion became increasingly clear. The operation represented a turning point. Not because investigators uncovered a dramatic secret. Not because a hidden mastermind suddenly emerged. But because the scale of the violence altered perceptions across Northern Ireland. Many people who had previously tolerated or justified certain forms of militant activity found themselves disturbed by Bloody Friday. The images proved difficult to ignore. The casualties proved difficult to rationalize. The destruction proved difficult to defend. Investigators noticed this shift indirectly. Public conversations changed. Questions changed. The focus moved away from abstract political arguments and toward concrete human consequences. Who died? Who suffered? Who benefited? Those questions carried increasing weight. And while investigators continued searching for evidence, Belfast itself was undergoing a broader reckoning. The city was asking whether it had reached a new and dangerous stage in the conflict. Whether boundaries had been crossed. Whether escalation had begun consuming the very people it claimed to represent. By the end of the investigative phase, many factual details of Bloody Friday had become clearer. The sequence of events was better understood. The locations were documented. The casualties were identified. The operation's scope was established. Yet some mysteries remained unresolved. Not mysteries about who suffered. That was painfully obvious. Not mysteries about what happened. The damage spoke for itself. The lingering mysteries concerned decisions. Judgments. Calculations made by human beings long before the bombs exploded. Decisions that transformed an already troubled city into a landscape of devastation. Those questions would not disappear. In fact, they would grow even larger as political leaders, military planners, journalists, historians, and the public began debating what Bloody Friday meant. Because the investigation had revealed something deeply unsettling. The bombings were not merely a tragedy. They were a warning. A warning about how far the conflict had evolved. A warning about how difficult it had become to distinguish strategy from catastrophe. And a warning that the search for justice would soon extend far beyond the boundaries of any ordinary criminal investigation. Every major investigation reaches a moment when the focus changes. At first, Investigators search for facts. Then they search for patterns. Eventually, if enough evidence accumulates, they begin searching for meaning. In the case of Bloody Friday, the breakthrough did not arrive in the form of a hidden fingerprint, a dramatic confession, or a single piece of evidence that suddenly solved everything. The breakthrough was larger than that. It emerged slowly from weeks of analysis, intelligence reports, witness accounts, political reactions, and the undeniable reality left behind by the bombings themselves. As investigators continued assembling timelines and reviewing evidence, a clearer understanding of the operation began to form. The attack had not been an isolated act. It had not been a spontaneous escalation. It was a carefully coordinated demonstration of capability. The sheer scale of the operation revealed something important. Those responsible had intended to send a message. The problem was that the message people received was not necessarily the one the planners expected. In the days following Bloody Friday, newspapers throughout Britain, Ireland, Europe, and beyond published images of the destruction. Photographs showed damaged streets, shattered buildings, rescue workers searching through debris, the faces of survivors, the grief of families. The story moved far beyond Belfast. What had happened on July 21 was no longer merely a local tragedy. It had become an international event. And with that attention came consequences. Political leaders immediately faced pressure to respond. Security officials faced pressure to explain. Communities faced pressure to choose how they would interpret the bombings. In many conflicts, violence is often evaluated through the lens of loyalty. Supporters view events one way. Opponents view them another. But Bloody Friday created a more complicated reaction. Even among people who had previously sympathized with Republican objectives, discomfort became increasingly difficult to hide. The civilian casualties changed the conversation. The image of a 14-year-old boy killed while attempting to warn others changed the conversation. The sight of ordinary workers and commuters caught in the destruction changed the conversation. The bombing campaign had demonstrated operational strength. At the same time, it had generated a wave of criticism that extended far beyond traditional political opponents. This realization became one of the most important breakthroughs in understanding the long-term significance of Bloody Friday. The operation succeeded tactically in creating chaos. It succeeded in demonstrating organizational reach. But many observers believed it had failed strategically. Instead of strengthening public support, it appeared to erode it. Instead of convincing people of the legitimacy of violence, it forced many to confront its consequences. Investigators were not responsible for measuring public opinion. Yet they could not ignore the shift occurring around them. Statements from political figures became increasingly severe. Media coverage emphasized civilian suffering. Religious leaders condemned the bloodshed. Ordinary citizens expressed outrage. The attack was no longer being discussed solely in terms of military objectives. It was being discussed in terms of morality. That distinction mattered. For years, Northern Ireland had experienced violence that many residents had come to view as part of a grim routine. Bloody Friday shattered that routine. The scale was simply too large. The casualties too visible. The destruction too extensive. And because the attack unfolded across multiple locations, almost everyone in Belfast felt connected to it in some way. Someone knew a victim. Someone knew a survivor. Someone worked near a blast site. Someone heard the explosions. Someone spent hours searching for a relative. The tragedy became impossible to isolate. Its impact spread through the city like shockwaves, continuing long after the bombs themselves had detonated. Meanwhile, inside government offices, another realization was taking shape. Officials increasingly viewed Bloody Friday as evidence that existing security strategies were failing to contain the conflict. For years, certain areas of Belfast and Derry had become difficult for authorities to control effectively. Republican organizations maintained significant influence within some neighborhoods. Security forces operated under growing pressure. The events of July 21 reinforced fears that the situation was deteriorating. The breakthrough, from the perspective of policymakers, was not about identifying individual participants. It was about recognizing the scale of the challenge. The conflict had reached a point where existing approaches no longer appeared sufficient. Something larger was coming. That conclusion would soon influence decisions with enormous consequences. Military planners began preparing responses. Intelligence assessments were reviewed. Security operations expanded. The bombing campaign became part of a broader calculation regarding the future direction of the conflict. For investigators studying the attack itself, another breakthrough emerged from the examination of warning procedures. As records were reviewed and timelines refined, a more complete picture developed regarding how authorities had attempted to respond. The findings revealed a situation far more complex than many initial public assumptions. Warnings had been received. Responses had been attempted. Resources had been deployed. Yet the concentration of threats had created a scenario that overwhelmed available capabilities. This understanding did not eliminate controversy. Far from it. Families still asked difficult questions. Critics still challenged official decisions. Supporters of different narratives continued arguing over responsibility. But investigators increasingly recognized that the day's chaos had been a central component of the operation itself. Confusion was not merely a byproduct. It was part of the mechanism. Too many threats. Too many locations. Too little time. The system became saturated. Once that happened, effective coordination became nearly impossible. This realization helped explain why the casualty count had been so severe despite the existence of warnings. Again, explanation was not the same as justification. Nothing could undo the deaths. Nothing could erase the injuries. But understanding the mechanics of the disaster brought investigators closer to understanding the event itself. As the months progressed, the significance of Bloody Friday became increasingly apparent. The attack represented more than a collection of explosions. It marked a turning point in public perception. A turning point in security policy. A turning point in the conflict. Some historians would later argue that the true breakthrough occurred not inside police files but inside the minds of ordinary people. People who had tolerated certain levels of violence suddenly found themselves questioning where that path led. People who had viewed the conflict through abstract political arguments found themselves confronted with shattered buildings and grieving families. People who had believed escalation would produce results began wondering whether escalation simply produced more funerals. These questions spread quietly. Not always publicly. Not always immediately. But they spread. And once they appeared, they proved difficult to silence. For the families of victims, however, the concept of a breakthrough often felt meaningless. No investigative finding could restore a lost child. No political realization could reverse an explosion. No strategic reassessment could return a loved one to the dinner table. Their grief remained personal, immediate, permanent. While governments debated policy and analysts debated consequences, families continued mourning. That reality grounded every discussion surrounding Bloody Friday. Because beneath every political lesson stood human loss. As summer turned toward autumn, Belfast itself began changing. Damaged areas were repaired. Glass was replaced. Businesses reopened. Traffic returned. The city attempted to reclaim normality. Yet traces of the tragedy remained everywhere. Not only in physical scars but in memory. People remembered where they had been. They remembered what they had seen. They remembered the uncertainty that had consumed the city during those 80 minutes. Collective memory became its own form of evidence. A reminder that history is not preserved solely in official documents. It is preserved in people. The breakthrough, ultimately, was not a discovery that ended the story. It was a discovery that transformed it. Bloody Friday could no longer be viewed as just another episode in an already violent conflict. The scale of the event forced everyone involved to confront larger questions. How much violence was too much? What objectives justified such risks? Who truly paid the price? And what would happen next? Those questions soon became impossible to ignore. Because only 10 days after Bloody Friday, the British government would launch one of the largest military operations seen in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. The bombing campaign had changed calculations at the highest levels. The consequences were already beginning to unfold. The investigation had revealed the mechanics of the attack. The public reaction had revealed its human cost. The political response would reveal something else entirely. Bloody Friday was not the end of a chapter. It was the moment a new chapter began. One that would reshape Belfast, reshape the conflict, and leave an imprint on Northern Irish history that would endure for generations. And as authorities prepared their next move, the city stood once again on the edge of transformation. This time, everyone knew it. When people hear the phrase justice served, they often imagine a courtroom. They imagine defendants seated behind lawyers. They imagine prosecutors presenting evidence. They imagine a judge delivering a sentence. They imagine a moment when years of uncertainty finally collapse into a verdict. Bloody Friday does not fit neatly into that familiar structure. There was no single courtroom capable of containing the scale of what had happened. No single trial capable of addressing every explosion. No single verdict capable of answering every question left behind in the shattered streets of Belfast. That reality would become one of the most frustrating and painful aspects of the story. Because after the smoke cleared, after the casualties were counted, after investigators completed their reports, people still wanted something deeper than explanations. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice. They wanted reassurance that the lives lost on July 21, 1972, would not simply become another entry in an expanding list of tragedies. Yet justice during the Troubles was rarely straightforward. The conflict existed in a space where crime, politics, ideology, security, and community identity overlapped constantly. Actions that one group condemned as terrorism were described by another group as resistance. Individuals viewed as criminals by some were regarded as defenders by others. Every legal process unfolded inside that complicated reality. In the aftermath of Bloody Friday, authorities intensified efforts against Republican organizations. Security operations expanded. Intelligence gathering increased. Surveillance networks grew more extensive. The British government faced enormous pressure to demonstrate that the bombing campaign would not go unanswered. The attack had not merely damaged buildings. It had challenged state authority. It had exposed vulnerabilities. And it had generated international attention. The response arrived quickly. Only 10 days after Bloody Friday, British forces launched Operation Motorman. The scale of the operation was extraordinary. Thousands of soldiers participated. Armored vehicles moved into areas that had become difficult for authorities to control. Barricades were removed. Strongholds were entered. The operation represented one of the largest military actions undertaken by Britain since the Suez Crisis. For government officials, this was part of restoring order. For military planners, it was part of regaining control. For many residents, it represented another dramatic escalation in a conflict that already seemed endless. Whether viewed as necessary or controversial, Operation Motorman revealed an important truth. Bloody Friday had altered calculations at the highest levels. The bombing campaign produced consequences far beyond the immediate casualties. It changed policy. It changed strategy. It changed the direction of the conflict itself. In that sense, the first form of justice sought after Bloody Friday was not judicial. It was governmental. Authorities attempted to demonstrate that such an attack would generate a decisive response. But governmental action and personal justice are not the same thing. For grieving families, political consequences could never replace lost loved ones. A military operation could not bring a son home. A security initiative could not erase trauma. A policy change could not undo an explosion. The gap between public response and private grief remained enormous. As years passed, that gap became increasingly apparent. Families continued carrying memories. Survivors continued carrying scars. Witnesses continued carrying images they could never fully forget. Meanwhile, the conflict itself continued. More bombings occurred. More shootings occurred. More funerals followed. Northern Ireland entered years marked by continuing violence. For many people affected by Bloody Friday, this created a painful feeling. Their tragedy had not ended the cycle. It had become part of it. The search for justice therefore expanded beyond legal accountability. It became a search for recognition. A search for acknowledgement. A search for historical truth. People wanted the suffering of victims remembered. They wanted names remembered. They wanted stories remembered. Most importantly, they wanted the human cost of the violence recognized regardless of politics. This desire became increasingly significant as decades passed. Time has a strange effect on public tragedies. Memories fade. Headlines disappear. New generations grow up with little direct knowledge of events that once dominated public attention. Yet for survivors and families, the passage of time often works differently. The years do not erase the loss. They merely place greater distance between the present and the moment everything changed. A father still remembers. A mother still remembers. A sibling still remembers. The calendar moves forward, but memory remains anchored. As Northern Ireland slowly moved toward a peace process during the later decades of the 20th century, discussions surrounding past violence became unavoidable. Every community carried grievances. Every community carried stories. Every community carried pain. Any serious attempt to build peace required confronting those realities. That process was neither simple nor comfortable. Questions emerged repeatedly. How should victims be remembered? How should responsibility be discussed? How should societies address acts of violence committed during political conflict? There were no easy answers. There still are not. Bloody Friday remained part of those conversations because it occupied a unique place in public memory. The scale of the bombings made the event impossible to ignore. The civilian casualties made the event impossible to dismiss. And the lasting controversy surrounding warnings, responsibility, and consequences ensured that debate continued long after the physical damage had been repaired. Then, 30 years after the attack, an important moment occurred. In 2002, the IRA issued an apology to the families of civilians who had been killed or injured during Bloody Friday. For some observers, the apology represented a significant acknowledgement. For others, it arrived far too late. No statement could undo decades of grief. No words could restore lost lives. Yet the apology mattered because it reflected a recognition that the civilian suffering caused by the operation could not simply be overlooked. The passage of 30 years had not erased the tragedy. If anything, time had clarified it. Many individuals associated with Republican politics would later describe Bloody Friday as a grave mistake. Not merely because of its political consequences. Not merely because of public reaction. But because of the human cost. That acknowledgement carried weight. History often encourages people to defend past decisions. Admitting error is far more difficult. The willingness of some participants and supporters to recognize the suffering caused by the bombings became an important part of the event's legacy. Still, for families, acknowledgement and justice remained separate concepts. An apology may offer recognition. It cannot provide restoration. The dead remain dead. The injured remain injured. The missing years remain missing. That reality sits at the heart of nearly every discussion about historical violence. What does justice look like when the damage cannot be repaired? What does accountability mean decades later? Can acknowledgement ever be enough? These questions extend far beyond Bloody Friday. They appear wherever societies attempt to confront painful histories. The courtroom model of justice depends upon conclusions. A verdict. A sentence. A final chapter. Historical tragedies rarely provide such neat endings. Instead, justice becomes fragmented. Part legal. Part political. Part moral. part historical. One family may find comfort in public recognition. Another may never feel satisfied. One survivor may value an apology. Another may reject it completely. Each response is understandable. Each response reflects a different relationship with loss. As the years passed, memorials, documentaries, books, and public discussions ensured that Bloody Friday would not disappear from collective memory. The victims continued to be remembered. The events continued to be studied. The lessons continued to be debated. In a sense, remembrance itself became a form of justice. Not because memory solves anything, but because forgetting would compound the loss. To remember is to acknowledge that real people lived, suffered, and died. To remember is to refuse the reduction of human beings into statistics. To remember is to preserve the truth that behind every political conflict stand ordinary lives. And perhaps that is where the closest thing to justice ultimately emerged. Not from a single courtroom. Not from a single verdict. But from a growing willingness to confront the consequences of violence honestly. To recognize that the dead belonged to families before they belonged to history. To recognize that suffering cannot be measured solely through ideology. To recognize that no political objective can fully erase the human cost required to pursue it. Bloody Friday left behind many unanswered questions. It left behind grief. It left behind controversy. It left behind scars visible and invisible. But it also left behind a warning. A warning that would echo through the remaining years of the Troubles. A warning about escalation. A warning about civilian suffering. A warning about the illusion that violence can remain controlled once it has been unleashed. For some, justice meant accountability. For others, justice meant acknowledgement. For many, justice remained incomplete. Yet one truth endured beyond every debate. The victims deserved to be remembered. And history would make certain that they were. When a city experiences violence on the scale of Bloody Friday, time begins to split into two versions of itself. There is the time that historians measure. Dates. Reports. Investigations. Political consequences. And there is the time that people actually live inside. The time measured in anniversaries of loss. In empty chairs at family tables. In streets that never quite feel the same again. Belfast carries both versions of time at once. On maps, it is a city that continued to grow, rebuild, and eventually move toward peace. In memory, it is also a place where certain afternoons never stopped echoing. Bloody Friday sits at that intersection. A moment frozen in history that continues to move through memory. Years after the explosions, physical damage was repaired. Buildings were rebuilt. Traffic returned. Shops reopened. Children who had not yet been born in 1972 grew up in a city where the events of that day were already part of inherited history. But inheritance is not the same as distance. Stories were passed down. Names were spoken. Silences were noticed. For many families, July 21st never became just a date. It became a reference point for everything that came after. Before that day. After that day. The world divided into two parts. As time moved forward, Northern Ireland itself began changing in ways that would have seemed unlikely in the immediate aftermath of Bloody Friday. Decades of negotiation, political shifts, and exhausting compromise eventually led toward a peace process that reshaped the region. The violence did not disappear overnight. But gradually, the scale of conflict reduced. The presence of soldiers became less dominant in daily life. Checkpoints faded from roads. New generations grew up without the same constant exposure to bombings and shootings that defined earlier decades. Yet peace, when it arrived, did not erase the past. It required it to be acknowledged. The memory of events like Bloody Friday became part of a larger and more difficult conversation. A conversation about responsibility. About suffering. About how societies move forward without forgetting what they have endured. Within that conversation, Bloody Friday remains one of the most difficult chapters. Not because it is unique in its existence. but because of its intensity, because of the speed at which it unfolded, because of the number of lives it touched in such a short time, and because of the lingering debate over what could have been done differently. History often tries to categorize events neatly: good and bad, right and wrong, success and failure. But Bloody Friday resists those categories. It sits in a space defined by contradiction, strategic intent and human devastation, political objectives and civilian suffering, military planning and chaotic consequence. It is precisely this complexity that makes it endure in public memory. For those who lost loved ones, the meaning is simpler. There is no need for analysis to understand absence. There is no need for political theory to understand grief. A name is enough. A memory is enough. A life once present and now gone is enough to define the entire experience. For survivors, the memories often arrive unexpectedly. A sound that resembles an explosion. A crowded street that resembles a past scene. A news report that brings the past back into focus. Trauma does not remain in the past. It moves through time with the people who experienced it. Even as decades pass, certain moments remain accessible with disturbing clarity. This is part of why Bloody Friday continues to be discussed, studied, and remembered. Not because people wish to remain in the past, but because the past does not fully release its hold. In historical terms, Bloody Friday is often described as a turning point within the Troubles. A moment that demonstrated the scale of violence the conflict had reached. A moment that influenced military responses. A moment that shaped public perception. A moment that contributed to a growing recognition that escalation carried consequences far beyond political messaging. But history alone does not capture the full weight of it. Because behind every interpretation lies the human reality. A 14-year-old boy who tried to warn others. Workers who never returned home. Families who waited for news that never came. Survivors who carried memory instead of injury. People who lived long lives afterward still shaped by a single afternoon. As the final perspective on Bloody Friday comes into focus, it becomes clear that its legacy is not confined to one narrative. It is not solely a story of political conflict. It is not solely a story of military strategy. It is not solely a story of investigation or consequence. It is a story of how violence transforms ordinary environments into irreversible moments in human history. It is a story of how quickly normality can collapse. It is a story of how deeply communities can be affected by events that last less than 2 hours but echo for generations. And it is a story that refuses to fade quietly into the background of history. Because even in places where peace has taken root, the memory remains. Not always spoken. Not always visible, but present. In commemorations. In testimonies. In the way people talk about the past when they speak carefully, aware that the past still lives inside the present. Bloody Friday does not offer a simple lesson. It does not provide a neat conclusion. It does not resolve into a clear moral ending. Instead, it leaves behind questions that remain relevant long after the smoke has cleared. What is the cost of escalation in a conflict already defined by violence? How do societies judge actions taken in the name of political struggle when those actions cause civilian suffering? How do families rebuild meaning after irreversible loss? And how does a city learn to remember without being trapped by what it remembers? There are no final answers to these questions. Only continued reflection. Continued memory. Continued attempts to understand what happened and why it mattered. In the end, Bloody Friday is not only about what was destroyed. It is about what remained. The resilience of survivors. The persistence of memory. The determination of families to keep names alive. The slow effort of a society to move forward without denying its past. And perhaps that is where the story settles. Not in resolution, but in remembrance. A city once shaken by explosions now carries those memories quietly beneath its surface. And the people connected to that day continue to live, remember, and tell the story in their own ways. Because some days in history do not end. They simply become part of everything that follows. There are stories that end with justice. There are stories that end with resolution. And then there are stories like Bloody Friday, where the ending is not an ending at all, but a long continuation of everything that came before. Even decades later, the events of July 21, 1972 still exist in Belfast like an invisible layer beneath the present. The city has changed in ways that would have seemed impossible to those who lived through the height of the Troubles. Streets that once echoed with sirens and military patrols now carry the ordinary noise of modern life. Cafes operate where fear once dictated movement. New buildings stand where shattered structures were once left in ruins. A generation has grown up knowing Belfast not only as a place of conflict, but also as a place that moved beyond it. And yet, the past does not disappear simply because the present becomes calmer. For those who survived Bloody Friday, memory is not something that belongs to history books. It is something carried in the body, in the mind, in the smallest details of everyday life. A sound that resembles an explosion can still cause a moment of silence inside someone's chest. A crowded bus station can still trigger a flash of another time. Even ordinary summer afternoons can carry an unexpected weight when the light falls a certain way. For families who lost someone that day, the passage of time changes nothing essential. It only changes the shape of absence. The person who never came home in 1972 remains absent in every year that follows. Birthdays continue without them. Conversations continue without them. Entire branches of family history grow around the space they once occupied, always aware of the emptiness at the center. This is the quiet truth of events like Bloody Friday. They do not remain locked in the past. They become part of the structure of a community's identity, not always spoken about directly, but always present in the background of memory. As Northern Ireland moved through the long process of peacebuilding, Bloody Friday remained one of the reference points that shaped how people understood what had been lost and what had been learned. The peace did not erase the violence. It did not rewrite the past. Instead, it forced a new kind of relationship with it, one built on acknowledgement rather than denial, on memory rather than silence. In that space, the meaning of Bloody Friday continues to evolve. For some, it stands as a warning about the consequences of escalation, a moment when violence reached a scale that even many who lived through the Troubles found difficult to comprehend. For others, it remains a deeply painful reminder of lives cut short and futures erased in a matter of minutes. For historians, it is a case study in the limits of control during complex conflict situations, where warnings, intentions, and outcomes collide in unpredictable and often tragic ways. But beyond all analysis, beyond all interpretation, there remains something simpler and more permanent. Human life was lost. Human life was changed. And a city was marked in a way that time cannot fully undo. What remains most striking, even after all the political explanations and historical assessments, is how ordinary the beginning of that day was. People woke up, went to work, boarded buses,